Hey folks, thanks for watching my monologues. In case you haven't heard, I'm told there's an election coming up pretty soon. In some areas, there's a lot of violence and civil unrest. If you're in the market for personal protection for yourself or your family, I'd encourage you to visit Guns Etc. Guns Etc. is 10,200 square feet and they have product. And they're getting new product all the time. They'll work with you to get the exact type of protection that fits your needs. Stop by their store in Mesa or visit gunsetcetera.com where you'll have access to over $400 million worth of firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy October 5th, 2020. Kingsley Amis once said, "Everything that's gone wrong with the world since World War II can be summed up in one word: meeting." I think that wisdom would now apply to a different institution or a different event. Media. I was watching CBS Sunday Morning yesterday, viewership 5 or 6 million, depending on the year. It is probably the most well-produced, and by well I mean best staffed and high production value, all wrapped in a nice bow, news program. It's probably the best produced news program on anything, on any of the networks. And they had Ted Koppel do a big segment on the presidential election and the media yesterday. To say it was a swing and a miss would be an understatement. Rather, it melded everything wrong in how the media covers politics and revealed every bias it has tried to conceal, all the while showing us what they think of us. News Consumers in the Heartland was the name of the segment, and it opened, interestingly enough, with old footage of Walter Cronkite and John Kennedy campaigning in West Virginia in 1960. The first point was to show how and why a once solidly Democratic state in the Heartland has become a Republican outpost. Now, if you're going to look to the Heartland, West Virginia is kind of an odd place to highlight. One usually thinks the heartland of the Midwest, places like Ohio, the Dakotas, Indiana. And if you're looking for a volatile state, one that swings back and forth, there are a lot more unpredictable states than West Virginia. West Virginia has been voting for the Republican president for the last 5 presidential elections. But to West Virginia, CBS went. Maybe CBS knew what it could find in the Free Mountain State. Ted Koppel interviewed 3 people. 2 of the 3 were spouses to each other, a married couple. And he was asking them where they got their news and why they were voting for Donald Trump. His point, as would become clearer, was that social media has upset traditional news, and precisely because of this, people were subject to conspiracy theories and fake news via social media. And that was the reason they were voting for Trump. Never mind, as I said, West Virginia had been voting Republican for 20 years, 4 years before Facebook was launched, 6 years before Twitter. The first spouse he interviewed, he got to tell the world, was the reason for her support for Donald Trump. Didn't go to the economy or coal mining or really anything West Virginia. It was this, Koppel, quote, "You think God chose Trump to serve 2 terms? Elizabeth Estep answered, "Yes, I do." And that was that from Mrs. Estep. On to another voter, Dusty Klein, mother of 3. Koppel, "You listen to radio at all?" "No," she laughed. "You read the newspaper?" "No." Then he asked her about where she got her news. Facebook and social media was the answer. So we now see the typical voter, as the media wants us to see such voters, as the media sees all of us, as uninformed by their product and attributable to God's ordination. Before I go on, allow me to pause to point out that the media here is trying to show there is actually something wrong with people thinking God when they think a United States president. Somehow, when it's a Republican, the media does a really good job of trying to exacerbate this issue. Which is odd, because last I checked, every president we've ever had still blessed America and Americans in God's name in almost every speech, and was still sworn in on a Bible, and had the good people of this country, whatever the party president is, saying, "God bless the president. I, in fact, know synagogues and churches across the country, even in places like New York and California, where there are moments in their Saturday and Sunday prayers where the president, again, whoever it happens to be of whatever party, is prayed for in houses of worship. But somehow when people actually believe in what they routinely pray and what the president wishes his countrymen, God's blessing, and what the president is sworn in on, the Bible, somehow when people actually believe that, they are to be seen or easily characterized as some kind of lesser American, some kind of Yahoo. What matters to the media, if I may borrow from a man for all seasons, is not that we go through these rituals of public faith and politics, but rather that some people go through them and actually believe it. You know, as if there was actual meaning to those public and political rituals and statements. You know, as if this were 1787 or something when we started doing these things because people then thought it mattered and they took it seriously. Eureka. It actually turns out these public professions, these wishes, these prayers and oaths were not rituals of empty exactitude, like some passing instruction on an airline about how to fasten a seatbelt properly and where the emergency exits are. People actually do take these prayers and these blessings seriously, whether it's from them to the president or when the president says them to the American people. Let me add something else before I go to Ted Koppel's next bit in his and CBS's story from yesterday. The media, the culture, no problem with invocations of God or the Messiah when it's a Democrat. I mean, to hear CBS yesterday, you'd think someone like Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Obama actually might have invoked the Messiah to describe Barack Obama once upon a time. But wait, they did. To no judgment. You might think Barack Obama even wrote a bestseller titled with the sermon from his pastor. But wait, he did. To no judgment. You see, only the Democrats can invoke God, evidently. I guess we forgot that for a moment, or the voters in West Virginia did, or Ted Koppel did. One other point. As you'll see, and as you already know, the media likes to hold themselves out as some kind of sophisticated and educated class. They engage in what is called de haut en bas, a loan phrase from the French, meaning from high to low. They look down on all those who aren't of them. Do you then not find it a little interesting that they would not seek and try to find people of their own high class in their own minds, or rather the class they claim membership to, as to why those people in that class support Donald Trump? It's not as if they're hard to find. We have them on this show all the time. They write columns and books often. It's just not hard to find your Victor Hansons and William Bennett's and Dennis Prager's and literally thousands more. I know. I helped launch a group called Intellectuals for Trump 4 years ago. It's not hard. Don't you find it curious they never go to them? About as curious, I suppose, as that group not getting much media attention then 4 years ago either. For you see, there is a twofold operation running here. The media doesn't think you can be smart and a Republican, as they interpret smart. And when it sees those two things in the same person, they try to hide it, just as any perceived enemy of the state is deemed to be censored or disappeared when they speak something unpopular or contra state narrative. The state, interestingly enough here, however, is the media. The media is acting as the grand censor on behalf of political points of view, taking the place and business of an authoritarian state. This is all quite new and hard to wrap our heads and hands around because we enacted a First Amendment to protect the press from censorship from the state. The press, in other words, has its protections. The people have no protections when the press subsumes the role of the authoritarian state. They may yell and scream about a war against the media, the press. They cite to no censorship of it. But they themselves act as a true authoritarian state, determining what we can say and think or what we should say and think. So, too, is this true of academia. Why else fire the director of a radio station at, say, ASU when she points to a fact that is, well, perhaps inconvenient? But if I could go back to Ted Koppel's story, it gets rather telling. I must quote at length. This is from CBS News transcript. The story of the 2020 election on social media is really one of domestic partisan activity, said Kevin Roos, who writes a column on technology for the New York Times. We've seen large, hyper-partisan news outlets just getting enormous numbers on social media, and they're doing it in an environment where it's a pretty loose, laissez-faire attitude toward truth, and in which this goal is just to engage people to keep them clicking and scrolling. The audiences for these hyper-partisan news sources are basically disconnected from larger mainstream media. What a lot of these sources have in common, Roos said, is that they're very skilled at provoking outrage. There's a saying that what's enraging is engaging. Where once we assembled facts in order to change opinions, now there is an accumulation of opinions which ultimately distort the facts. Koppel said, "You're telling me that they have more people coming to them than collectively come to ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, the New York Times, the Washington Post? Spell it out for me. Where are they going?" There's a right-wing commentator named Ben Shapiro. He's very popular among conservatives, said Roos. And in the last 30 days on his Facebook page, he's gotten 51.4 million interactions. That's more than 5 times as many as the New York Times, and it's more than CBS, CNN, NBC, ABC combined. You're leaving me speechless here, Koppel said. Yes, all this from the organization whose evening news anchor, Dan Rather, was fired for distorting facts. And of course, an interview with the New York Times columnist here, a paper who last week lost an argument in federal court to dismiss the case against it by Nicholas Sandman for defamation. The same paper who sued against it by Sarah Palin has been reinstated by a federal court and is now going to a jury trial. That news came out last week as well. By the way, how many of you knew Sarah Palin's defamation suit was not dismissed, and that defamation requires known falsehoods to be published? A paper, New York Times, that had to correct itself for confusing a parody account with the official account of North Korea. A paper that has printed so many false stories and scoops it would take an entire monologue to detail. But a paper, nevertheless, that itself admitted it misreported the 2016 campaign, asking the public, as if they had the answers, did Donald Trump, quote, lead us and other news outlets to underestimate his support among American voters, close quote, question asked by publisher and editor of the New York Times a week after the 2016 election? No is the answer, by the way. It's just that the Times, like CBS, they're forgetting their Ian Malcolm lesson in Jurassic Park's Lost World, where John Hammond says, "Don't worry, I'm not making the same mistakes again." And Ian Malcolm responds, "No, you're making all new ones." There's so much more to this. They seem to have just discovered Ben Shapiro when they say, well, there's a right-wing commentator named Ben Shapiro, and he's very popular among conservatives. Ben Shapiro has been a best-selling author for 16 years. Note, by the way, he's not labeled as conservative, the way CBS or the newspapers describe, say, Michael Moore as a liberal. Ben Shapiro is right-wing. They also don't tell us one mistaken thing Ben has ever misreported, or one mistaken thing he has ever reported, or why his record may be worse than, say, the New York Times or CBS, because it isn't. You know that's why they don't tell us. You know what else they don't tell you? Ben Shapiro happens also to be religious and a graduate of Harvard Law School, summa cum laude. In fact, I'm going to tell you that the reason he has millions more interactions than CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the others in Ted Koppel's view of the good world and constellation, it's because he's more interesting, he's more appealing, and dare I say, more accurate than Koppel's pantheon. You don't get those kinds of numbers by being wrong or conspiratorial or uninteresting. I get why it all leaves Ted Koppel speechless by his own admission. It's the same speechlessness Dan Rather had when he was still trying to defend his story about George Bush and the National Guard. Earth to Ted, your story is broken because your storyline is broken. We just aren't going for the elitist turn down of the nose and tisk-tisking contempt you have for the people you claim to report on and for anymore. I used the phrase to Hottenbaugh earlier. Turns out it's the media that's confused the low and the high for far too long. Given the American people en masse, you should be looking up to them, not the other way around. We're glad you're speechless. It's been too long in coming, but you earned it for yourself. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.